Hello and welcome to the resumption of the Committee on the Revision of the Penal Code. We'll wait a few seconds while the public portion of the Zoom meeting fills up. Thank you all for joining us.
I'm not sure why
You're on.
I'm on, but it then, okay.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Dalton, how are you?
Okay, how are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
All right, let's get started. I don't think that today's meeting will last quite as long as we did yesterday, but I thought yesterday's was particularly productive. So I hope we can wrap things up well today. Today's meeting is a continuation of yesterday's hearings, and we have two main areas of business. First, a quick administrative update or two, and then a discussion of yesterday's hearing to focus research and continuing investigation by committee staff. We'll begin with the administrative matters. First, I'd like to approve the minutes from our January 21st meeting. Will someone second approving the minutes?
Second.
I'll second.
Terrific. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the minutes from January 21st are adopted. Next, I'm very happy to announce that we've hired another staff attorney, Joy Haviland, who will be joining us early next month. So our staff is growing. And we also anticipating hiring another attorney, which will be our fourth attorney, and we'll let everyone know when that hiring process begins. So we're slowly expanding. And of course, we thank the legislature and the governor for appropriating the funds to make that possible. Lastly, on the administrative front, I do want to flag that there are two bills now in the legislature based on our committee reports for the past prior reports. There's a mental health diversion bill, SB 1223, which is involves mental health diversion and the recommendations that we put out. And then AB 2746, which is from our initial inaugural report about traffic offenses. I'm happy to give anybody more information on that should they need it, but I just wanted to flag that the legislature continues to take our advice, which of course makes all our work worth it. But the main business of today's meetings is to discuss the testimony we heard yesterday and prioritize ideas and proposals for further research and refinement by committee staff. I want to emphasize that we are not voting or formally endorsing any recommendation today, but only identifying areas of committee interest based on what we heard yesterday and what was contained in the memos and written submission from our witnesses. The goal is that we will focus staff attention on specific proposals, and that staff will report back to us on details throughout the year. And as we have done in the past, we'll vote on final recommendation towards the end of the year. Those recommendations will of course be in our annual report. But again, today is merely the first step in the process. I thought yesterday was a especially productive meeting, and I want to thank staff for putting all together, particularly Rick, Owen, who I know went the extra mile in making sure that all of our witnesses were there and prepared. And I thought it was actually really very productive for me, and I learned a ton. All right, with that all said, Tom, can you please pull up the slide presentation? Great. So what Tom, Rick, and I have done is we put together a slides that basically summarize what we think were the main proposals that came up yesterday. And we wanted to run it by, the idea is for us as a committee to discuss these proposals, see if there are any that are missing, and then direct staff for further research. So can you get to the next slide, please? All right, so we've organized it into four main areas, which more or less follow the panelist presentations from yesterday: improving access to victims' rights, retail theft, victim compensation and restitution, and then restorative justice. Those are the main areas. All right, so on the area of improving access to victims' rights, we heard discussion that although both in statute and in the Constitution, there are a number of benefits and rights that are given to crime victims. Crime victims often either don't know that they exist, have difficult accessing them, and just don't have really availability to those rights. Some of it involves rights to financial restitution and compensation, but others is just rights to notice. And there seemed to be general consensus that these can be improved. One of the ways that they could be improved, and it seems to me, as my understanding, and Rick and or Tom jump in, is that each county enforces or informs victims of these rights, primarily Marcy's law rights and rights to compensation, on their own, right? So each county just handles it however they want, whether it's the DA's office or some other board that notifies victims, but there's no centralized state either organization, website, or even document that summarizes those rights and opportunities. Is that a fair summary, Tom or Rick?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what this crime victims have also said is most county, or it's very common to just not be informed at all too. So I think there's a lot of variation and across the state.
So a couple of ideas came up about how to, well, first of all, whether to make these rights more accessible and better known among crime victims, and then how to do it. Senator Skinner?
Well, Mike, before we get into how to do it, I think there's something missing on this ABC. There should either under A or a D would be the definition of victims, or maybe, I don't know, I don't mean it that, but rather that if we want to improve access to victims' rights, we also have to expand the pool of victims who are eligible for the rights.
Well,
And I don't think any of the categories I saw in the previous slide would have that. It would be under here somehow. So I think it's worth it that we have that separated and look at that.
sure. So where we do have something similar to that. So there are certain victim rights according to Marcy's law where you are an identified victim of a crime, and right to notice of parole hearings or post-conviction litigation, and I don't know, Tom or Rick, tell me what other notices you're available to. Then there's compensation and who is entitled to compensation.
Okay, so maybe it should be improving access to victims' rights and services, because there's Marcy's law, which is a very specific set of rights. And then there's other statutes around provision of services or compensation to victims. And so I would like us to look at the broader, not only that which is covered under Marcy's rights, but other provision that's been put into statute.
Right, we have that under the compensation part of the conversation.
We had that where?
It's in the following slide.
Okay.
So
When I
basically,
looked at
sure.
the previous slide and the categories, this seemed like the only category to talk about, just broader, that not only is there expanding the notion of what victims have availability to this, but then there is also the information to them, right? So if we're going to improve information, it shouldn't only be to one set of victims.
Sure. So let me just make sure I understand. So there's the category of information, Marcy's law information.
That's one.
That's one category. There's the compensation group, people who are entitled to victims' compensation, which we'll talk about that and the eligibility criteria and whether or not you have to report it to the police and things like that. And then this third is, you're saying that there's a third bucket of sort of services that might be available to the victims that are independent of the first two.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes, and some of those are in statute, yes.
Tom and Rick, do you have thoughts on that, where that goes? Or maybe we just put it in as
Yeah, I
access
think
to
we do.
additional services. Say
Yeah,
again?
we could do further research on what services are available to victims.
Right. I mean, this is, I guess what I'm trying to get is, from my point of view, from what I heard yesterday, there is that victims, that there's a logic, there is a rationale for serving victims. And we have some programs and we have some rights,
Mhm.
but they're not universally, neither are the victims aware of them, nor is every victim entitled, and that's, so looking at a bigger picture of if
Yeah.
we accept that there is a value to providing services and support to victims, then what recommendations would we make to enhancing or to fulfilling that?
I don't know if this goes to answering your question, Senator, but one of the things that struck me yesterday was how frayed all of the different services and notifications and compensation, seems to come from every different angle and extraordinarily complicated, and that there isn't one centralized either website or even a document or even notice that, you know, perhaps judges would have to announce. And one of the things that I think that we should consider is that either some entity, whether it's the Victims' Compensation Board or even the Attorney General or perhaps some third entity, is responsible for publishing this information, I would think, online in a single one-stop shop. It really did seem just the access and information, which sort of came up in our first panel, seemed very difficult to get to. And I think that we should try to figure out a way to ease that or look further into easing that information flow.
Yeah, I agree. Something like a clearinghouse, because as Nancy suggests, they're just all different types of victims, different types of offenses and the criteria, and no one place where if someone considers themselves a victim, you know, where would they go to see what category they fit into? So it is kind of a hodgepodge of statutes. I don't know if we can consolidate the statutes in one section for ease of access. But certainly what you're talking about, Michael, I think is a very good idea. Whomever takes in that responsibility in whatever form it comes out. And if it requires an amendment somewhere to a penal code provision, but it is a hodgepodge.
Does that get close to what you were thinking about,
Yes,
Senator?
but the other thing I would recommend is, so at least I'm operating on the presumption that there is a value to public safety for serving victims, for some
Yeah.
level of support to victims. So what would also be helpful is for our staff to put together some of the data from research as that documents that value.
Hmm.
It documents the value of victim services towards public safety.
Correct.
Yeah.
Because then we, in putting something forward, recommendations, it's based on
Data.
yeah, and that we're trying to advance improvement in public safety, which is part of the whole reason we're looking at the penal code.
Sure. I think that there's also value in its own rights in making sure that victims know that their rights, whether or not it necessarily improves
Right.
public
But
safety.
helping to substantiate why we would be taking this trouble of looking at what type of programs and services the state provides for victims, it would be good to have some grounding in that. Some people spoke to it, but it would be good to have some grounding in that.
Yeah, and
Okay.
it might be, this kind of came up, I think we had that presentation from the person who was formerly with the San Francisco DA's office. I mean, not only requiring judges to say something, but also prosecution as part of their
right.
holistic approach, not just to convict somebody, but to also have a program to assist victims of those crimes.
Well, let's look into what I would suggest is that we look further into all the different services and including compensation and notice of rights that are available to crime victims, and whether or not that can be centralized in some place or should be. There's some conversation yesterday about, different languages and making sure that's not all in legalese and the statutes, and just so it's understandable, I think would be a good service.
Yeah.
All right, next. I believe this was Justice Moreno's suggestion. I'm going to be about whether or not judges should, at sentencing, say something to the effect of the sentence is 10 years, but with credit for maximum credit available, currently available. Of course, credits change regularly, and that might be a deal breaker here. But under current credit schemes, the anticipated shortest sentence would be X.
Or something like, I don't know if you want to get into the exact calculation, defendant will serve 80% of the balance of that sentence, or 50% with conduct credits. Something very simple, as opposed to saying you're going to serve, 18 months, because you just never know. Just at that moment, a simple declaration, of the sentence, credits for time served, the balance for which the defendant will serve 80% or 50%.
And what I would been thinking about was, I liked Carlos's idea, but I was thinking maybe it should be, and this obviously has a cost, the legislature has to think about whether they would do this, but a letter would be sent to, once there's been a conviction, the court has ruled, a letter would be sent to the victim that indicates, X, was sentenced to this. And then in some simple language, this is if it, like it's an indeterminate sentence, this means that it, at this year, this person would have the right to go before the parole board.
Yeah.
But, in other words, that it's not like a automatic. And that's something like, additionally, if they participate in, if they are incarcerated in state prison and participate in rehabilitative programs, they could be credited and be allowed to, an earlier time to go before the parole board. So it's some simple, just kind of, here's the way the rules work. So it's not definitive, like, oh, this person may only serve 8 years if they're 10 years, but they may only serve 6, but it's just, here's how the rules work. Yes, this is the sentence, but what it means is they're eligible for parole in the first time at this, but they can also participate in programs which may allow them to be eligible earlier and whatever, something. Yeah.
I like this idea as well. I wonder if other states do it. My only concern is that there's so many exceptions, and that the credits can change and frequently do over the course of someone's
But that's why I was
incarceration.
thinking we don't be specific. We just say the generic, that they have the possibility of participating in rehabilitative programs that may or might, right?
Shorten their sentence. Right. And the governor can always commute somebody's sentence. I mean, there's a lot of caveats, but I think it's probably doable in a way that is somewhat understandable. I mean, as soon as you enter prison, they put you into a computer system that generates your, what they call the earliest possible release date or earliest possible parole date. So that's doable with the caveat that I said. I don't know, Rick and or Tom, do you guys have any further thoughts or knowledge about this type of idea?
I don't think we've encountered any state that would do that. I mean, it's but we can look into that. I think part of it too might some information about sort of what the average time served for someone in this situation might be helpful, because as you all are discussing, there's so if you really stack up every possible credit, suddenly you're doing less than 50% of a sentence. But if there's 2 guys who actually do that, it's a little misleading too. So information about
It,
what
it
the
would- it
normal
would be
course is.
interesting to see what other states, if any states.
If
do
any
that.
state, right.
Yeah, I just brought that up because the judge the other day, I forget the controversial case, she kind of like right on the record said 2 years and what you're going to be out, you're going to serve what 16 months. And when you saw the victims, the families, they said,
Action.
yeah, he's only going to do 16 months on a voluntary manslaughter, and that's the truth.
Right, right, right.
And it does get people angry. But I think just the idea, I think that it's going to boil down to who's going to be responsible for providing that information and in what form, how generically. And I know the judges won't like, the court system won't like doing it. So it's a bureaucratic thing.
And nobody likes extra work, but obviously it would probably boil down to the court system or to the attorney general.
Yeah.
But you're right, Mike. I mean, the ERPD is, I think, available on CDCR's website for those folks who are in prison. So it's kind of done in a way. Just
That is true. That is true.
Right,
Everybody
so
should
that's
know.
the kind of research you could tell us, what kind of things like that are, and then we can think about, all right, is that enough? Is that what we would point people to?
Well, no, that's very true. It already exists. So if you know somebody's name, you can find out when they're earliest possible. That's already public information. But maybe we can figure out a clever that's not too cost intensive way to get that information to people. Whether it's sending them the letter, that's obviously a very customer service friendly way, but perhaps just making sure people understood that the inmate locator, which is already public, has, this information is already public.
That's great. And it only applies to prison sentences then too.
Right. This only applies to prison sentences. Obviously, it gets much more complicated in jail.
Jail, right, right.
But at least for prisons, it already does exist.
Yeah.
And then we're responding to what Ralph Diaz was describing as being, victims' reactions. So
Yeah, right now it only exists in this program that's called the inmate locator, which you would think, which is mostly used for people to use to if you want to write letters to somebody to find out what specific prison they happen to be located in. But it does include other information like earliest possible release date, actions that happen at the parole board. There's some other data in there that's already public and available. So I think that's worth thinking about. All right, moving to number C. This wasn't something that we discussed yesterday, but it was alluded to a couple times in the materials that were sent out, is that there's a federal survey of crime victims that's done, I think, is it by the Department of Justice, Tom?
That's right. BJS. Yep. Justice Statistics.
And can we, or should we? I mean, we can, but should something happen in similarly in California? Should the Department of Justice be required to do some sort of survey of crime victims in order to sort of capture? Basically, this falls under our data collection business. And just, I'm generally in favor of more data. Of course, imposing new requirements on other agencies is probably not great, but I don't know if people think this would be particularly valuable or not. All right. Well, that silence, I think, tells us, at least for the time being, let's not make that a priority for staff research for right now. All right, next slide. All right, the next topic of conversation that we heard from yesterday was about retail theft, which is obviously, very much in the news these days. And I was actually pretty impressed with Ms. Michelin, who's the president of the Retail Association. And she, as I could distill down what she was telling us, that she basically had two significant, I thought, pretty specific recommendations or suggestions for us. One was to tighten up enforcement of online resellers. And I know Senator Skinner, I believe that you already have a bill pending on this, but this strikes me as, sort of going after the drug kingpins rather than the drug users on the corner, which seems to make some sense to me. Senator, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add about your bill or anything that you think this committee can do to help on this score?
We could certainly ask staff to look at whether mine is, I'm optimistic mine will get through just because of, but whether it's adequate for what was being addressed, and maybe it's not any recommendations for changes in mine, but rather if there's further action that needs to be done in the future.
Does your bill have a number already?
Oh, yeah, but I can't remember it.
Okay.
Hold on. I have too many.
Sorry to put
All
you on
the
the
years
spot.
I've
like
had-
That was unfair.
It's cool. I'll look it up. Don't worry.
that. Pop quiz. I apologize.
Don't worry. Don't worry.
The other recommendation that she suggested that she seemed to be very much in favor for was specific diversion programs for people who caught shoplifting. I was also impressed and thought that this seemed like a good idea. I think that it is complicated, as we've talked about diversion in so many different other ways in the past. Surely somebody would prefer diversion over a long jail sentence, or the same equal amount of diversion to the jail sentence. But if you're looking at a very short jail sentence and a very long diversion program, that makes the diversion less desirable. But I think it's worth certainly investigating some more. She seemed to indicate that the Retail Association, their foundations, had financial capability to really do this. And they were really supportive of it. And especially given the climate, and that they think that this is a solution to, an apparent, I'm not sure it's actual, but she didn't even have the data on it, problem of shoplifting. I think that every resources we can should be focused on potential solutions here.
Yeah, I'm less enthusiastic about this because it's actually focusing on the crime and the accused and not so much on the victim. And I just wonder if there is kind of a cure for shoplifting. I mean, I was kind of surprised that she actually came up with this suggestion, but the focus seems to be on the accused and not on the victim. So I'd be interested, and I do think it falls under the rubric of diversion generally for misdemeanors, etc. So I'm not sure that it fits with our focus on restitution and compensation for the victim. But
whether or not it fits into the category of victims benefit, I mean, is it a good idea or not? I mean, right? If it's a good idea, let's support it, right?
yeah, I think it's kind of kind of pejoratively a fool's errand. I don't know how you stop shoplifting. It's an economic crime. People are going to do it. So it is jobs and stability that are kind of would address it.
Yeah.
But it's an endemic. I mean, I used to prosecute misdemeanors as a city attorney, and it's just cuts across all levels of society, and it's a mental disorder in a sense, and it's a big topic, and it's just a huge. I mean, if we looked at the number of prosecutions for shoplifting and say in urban centers, it would just be enormous. So
I agree that it's a huge problem, a complex problem involving mental illness and addiction and homelessness and all sorts of problems. But if the primary victim of shoplifting, the retailers, think that this is a good solution, I mean, perhaps we should look into their data. I mean, they've done it elsewhere, she said, in other states.
Yeah, I was
But has it
surprised.
reduced shoplifting? I mean, that's the key. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's assuming that job training is the thing that's going to stop the shoplifter.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I presume that they wouldn't be recommending it if they didn't think that it was helping.
Yeah, I think we had to look into their.
yeah, look at their data.
Yeah, let's look at their data. Let's see if we can get more of their data on that. I mean, I was intrigued. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. I was-
And to answer your question, Justice
Justice
Moreno, about whether or not this fits into victims' rights, in my mind, it's almost like a restorative justice program with with Target, or with Safeway. It's hard to have restorative justice when it's when the victim is a major corporation.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
all right. Moving along.
Mike, I think Judge Espinoza may have some.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see your hand. Judge Espinoza.
I just wanted to say that I think the metric we should be looking at isn't necessarily whether it reduces shoplifting generally, but whether it reduces recidivist behavior by giving somebody job training in an actual job, what impact that has on recidivism.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, recidivism is always our, go-to metric, but there's so many, jobs, homes,
Yeah.
satisfaction, family reunification. But let's look at the data. I mean, I presume that they're not doing this as window dressing, and that they really believe in it. And I love to see what they have to say. I mean, and it did, Tom or Rick, she did seem to say that the National Retail Association is doing this in other states. Is that right?
I think we'll need to follow up and see exactly what the scope of that is. There's this RISE job training program that we can definitely follow up about.
Okay. Next. All right. Here we're talking about victims restitution. We talked a little bit about some of these issues already with Senator Skinner. I think the biggest idea and the most ambitious we put as A here. I have been sort of in my own mind throughout this whole process over the past several weeks that we've been putting this together, often conflating and confusing, honestly, the difference between restitution and compensation. And that just goes to part of the frayed ends and the confusing nature of the whole business. I think that it was Secretary Diaz who mentioned this model, and also maybe one of our other presenters, of that the state compensates or provides restitution to crime victims upfront, rather than what the current system that we have now is that somebody who commits a crime, and it could be a heinous crime like rape, is ordered to pay restitution of X thousands of dollars. They're making 50 cents an hour in prison, and they send checks of $2.50 to their crime victims once a month, which to me seems completely fruitless and probably net negative. I realize that it would be a quite expensive endeavor to for the state to pay that restitution up front, and then for the state separately, apart from the victim, collect that money from the person who committed the crime themselves but to me, it seems like a much more preferable system, again, if money wasn't an issue, which of course it is. Did I set up the issue clearly? And I was curious if people have thoughts about this.
Well,
Yes, Senator Skinner.
so the restitution issue, in a way, I'd like to have a little more data as to how many people who we convict are also ordered to have a restitution order, and is it what's the magnitude, and is it reflect an actual cost of the harm, or a like when you go to court around it's sort of like for pain and suffering or something. I mean, I think it's worth it for us to understand it more, because I think we know that for many of the large judgments that the Constitution, that restitution is never fully paid. That number one, the person who is incarcerated, is obviously not contributing much while they're incarcerated. And then once they are no longer incarceration, they're, even with wage garnishment, if it's any kind of large amount, it can take years to ever fully be paid. So then it kind of gets at, okay, what is it that we are accomplishing with this order of restitution. And maybe we need to understand a little better about whether it should be rethought. Because if we just recommend, oh, state should pay restitution up front, I mean, that beyond being a lot of money, it's sort of to what end is the restitution? What is the I mean, I don't know if it's logic, but what's purpose is it serving?
Mhm.
Would justify the state putting its money there. So I think a little more.
I would be very interested in, and I agree with the senator, I'd be very interested in, I don't know, Rick or Tom, if we already have this data on, how many people are ordered to pay restitution, for what purposes, how much of it actually gets paid at the end of the day, and that issue. I think the value of it is, if you're a crime victim, that right now our system encourages people to feel whole with largely punitive aspect of it, that you feel the justice is being served because the person who stole from you or hurt you is being put in prison. Where if I was robbed or hurt, I would just rather have my car window replaced than have somebody go to jail for that. So, and whether as a society that's the best way to pay back victims. But so we can talk about the values piece of it. And I think it would give people more trust in the system. I'm curious what other states do. It was confusing to me. Some people said, well, this is really only happening in the UK and in Norway, but then some other folks said that there are several states that do some version of this. So I definitely think further, research into all of these questions would be helpful. Tom or Rick, do you have anything to add?
It is very confusing. I think on that last point, Mike, I think other countries do the restitution piece up front where you don't have to wait. And some other states do more compensation differently than California does. So yes, the overlap is very confusing. And we have a little bit of data that actually Delaney Green, who was a panelist yesterday, collected a Public Records Act request about restitution orders. I don't think there is any one place to get it. So it's sort of a little bit piecemeal. But what she was able to determine that, about half of in counties that represent about half of the state for a 10-year period, they ordered over $1 billion in restitution. So let's double that. Let's say it's $2 billion over 10 years, but collected about 10% of it. So it's a lot of money, but a lot of it, to your point, Senator Skinner, doesn't appear to actually be collected. It'd be very interesting to get solid information on that, but I think that's the best we'll be able to do.
It also, given what we compensate people who are incarcerated, what we pay them for work, it creates it kind of continues the sentence to a degree. And I'm not trying to say there's not any justification for restitution. I'm just saying that because it keeps them in a financial servitude in effect. And if they have families, it affects families. And what I learned is that affects families far more than we would even think, because you think, okay, well, if this person has this debt, or their income, we're taking their income away, then their family would qualify for certain benefits, which would help compensate for that. But in fact, when the state garnishes someone's wages, and let's say the family goes to apply for CalFresh benefits, the CalFresh eligibility is factored on the wage, not on the garnishment. So the family then does not get those benefits, but the wage is garnished, and there's a perpetuation of a circumstance that is not necessarily beneficial to a community or a neighborhood.
I agree, Skinner. There is research on that we could kind of highlight a little bit more about how restitution orders kind of continue a cycle of poverty with those payments and wage garnishments. And I think to your other question, there are some, not states, but there are some counties within states that are doing pilot programs of paying restitution up front that we've heard mention of. So we can get more information on that as well.
I just had a quick question.
Yeah,
This is, I mean, it is related. Remember when Florida, I think, restored voting rights to formerly incarcerated individuals, but I think the governor said they have to have fully served their sentence, and that included restitution. Therefore, they were not eligible to vote. Does California have anything like that? I mean, are there any disabling features that would apply to impact someone who was incarcerated or released and still on parole, yet they hadn't fulfilled their restitution obligations? Anything like that?
Yeah, I think there it actually is a bar to expungement if you haven't
Okay.
paid your restitution order. I
Yeah.
don't know if I don't believe there's any
On the voting.
voting.
certainly not
restriction.
voting.
Yeah.
Well, I had two thoughts that I want to raise. I don't know if this is too much of an accounting shell game, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Yeah.
I would be support dramatically increasing the salaries of people who are working in prison, and then using that money to pay the restitution, rather than paying people, pennies on the dollar. Paying people in prison more money rather than the slave wages that they're currently being paid. But in an effort both to make the work more valuable to people incarcerated, but also to the victims who are only getting what appears to be 10% of whatever the restitution payment would be.
Right.
Now, again, this might be a shell game because it's all coming from the government anyway. But I kind of like that idea.
Yeah, I kind of like that too. There's, I think articles about these inmates who were on fire suppression teams, making pennies on the dollar. Yet, and again, there were, I think, disabling factors even once they were released in terms of getting a similarly paying job. But I think there's something about restoring a person's kind of worth when they're making more money, and if 50% of that is going to restitution, I think it's a win-win. So I agree with you, Michael.
The other thing along those lines, and again, some very back of the envelope math. Tom, did you say that you thought that the study showed that there's $2 billion in restitution ordered a year in the state? Is that your very back of the envelope?
That was over 10 years, so I don't know.
But right.
20 million a year, yeah.
You follow my math.
Oh, so it's not as high as I would have guessed.
And only 10% of it is being filled,
Yeah.
correct? Back of the envelope. And
Very
if we
back in the back of the envelope, yeah.
But if we said we're going to, maybe we can't make it all the way up to 100%, but maybe we could double what's actually being paid.
Yeah.
And doesn't sound like a huge number to me.
Yeah. My sense has been, I don't know what Peter's sense is, that, restitution orders were largely illusory, that they were never really going to get, restitution unless your defendant was a high net worth individual. And even then, you take someone like O.J. Simpson, who had, I don't know, millions of dollars, millions of restitution orders, but he was able to, conceal and maneuver. But you really need a lawyer really to go after. It's like a restitution order is like a judgment. You convert it to a judgment and you can renew that every 10 years. But in how many cases is that going to be worthwhile for anyone to take those kinds of extraordinary measures? So I'm not surprised. I'm kind of frankly surprised that it is as high as 10% of the 2 billion.
And of course, it leaves people crippled with crippling debt, as we talked about, on their way out of prison, which only creates, probably is not to the benefit of public safety. In any event, seems like there's there's a lot of grist here to dig into for staff, and let's, especially on the data front, let's look into it some more and how other states are doing it. And moving on to item B. This is an idea. So right now, the way that compensation works is that you have to, if you're a victim of a crime, you have to go through the state is only the payer of last resort, meaning if you have insurance to cover or other means to cover the loss that you incurred, and this is just financial loss. This isn't any emotional or physical losses. This is doctor's bills or funeral expenses, that the state will pay for that, but only as if you can prove that you can't find another way to pay for it.
It's the last resort.
It's the payer of last resort. So obviously this is an expense, but should California move to a system where the state pays for it upfront rather than waiting for all these other insurance programs to pay for it?
Yeah, I don't think that would ever happen. Nancy? Yeah.
We've not put all the language in our bill where we are making some, recommending some changes to this in print yet. And I just texted my staff to see what we had been contemplating regarding the reimbursement versus the other, but I
Yeah.
didn't get my answer yet. But
You know, every statute that I'm aware of, you know, say like Medi-Cal or services from regional center for your disabled child. It's if you have insurance or there's some other source of compensation, you're obligated to go there first. And these programs are the, you know, last resort. And then there's still an unfulfilled need. So I don't think the government is going to come up front and then leave you to maybe double recover or whatever to recover an unpaid balance. They're going to want to be last.
Of course, everybody's going to want to be last. And I think what the problem is too often the victims are last, and it's another barrier towards making victims whole as much as possible as we can as a society, which I think should be part of the goal of the justice system. And this is just another one of those frayed ends. Perhaps I don't know if other states have clever models to dealing with this. If every state has it as the payer of last resort, if it can be merged into what we were discussing earlier about some sort of centralized agency that can help with this, so it just doesn't become incredibly administratively burdensome on people already going through being crime victims. I don't know if this is just further research, or Tom or Rick, if there's anything to add to this right now, if you've run across any promising models.
I think one promising model is already used in California, which is the trauma recovery centers, where I think there's between 15 and 19 of them throughout the state, and they provide direct services to victims, including direct cash aids in the times of emergency, so that victims aren't applying for reimbursement for an expense that they already paid for. But so one idea could be to expand the use of trauma recovery centers and other more local community-based victim service groups to provide that direct aid rather than relying on a reimbursement model.
And are they generally, do we have ideas about whether or not these are well used and people think the services are good?
Yes, there has been some studies from UC San Francisco's Trauma Recovery Center, which I believe was the first one, that showed very promising results. But I would also say that, remember, in this area, California is a leader in a lot of ways. So I don't think looking to other states in this particular area is going to yield a lot of great results. There could be some models that we're happy to look into, but I think it's more so about improving the system in California that's already, at the forefront, but could be made better.
Okay.
So so as is stated there, California's program now is based on reimbursements, but it has caps. It both has a lengthy process. So you might, for example, let's say one of the things is a funeral. And it may be 6 months before you would receive your quote unquote reimbursement. And the reimbursement, in other words, there's many families who are affected by that who don't even have the funds for the funeral. So what we are contemplating in our bill now is that we would raise the caps, the existing caps on various of these reimbursable things like funeral expenses, crime scene cleanup, relocation, things like that, and streamline the process for a person to be able to get the funds, in some cases up front.
Yeah, I think the streamlining in particular, and I guess the caps, that all sounds quite good. All right. This is moving on to C, which is, we alluded to earlier. These are some of the eligibility criteria that makes it appears many people ineligible for compensation. So if you're on parole or probation, you're disqualified from receiving compensation if you're a crime victim. There is, I think, some ambiguity in what constitutes cooperation with law enforcement. There's a requirement that you are cooperative with law enforcement in order to get compensated, and that you have to report your crime to police in order to be compensated. We heard testimony yesterday that all three of those are significant impediments to a large percentage of crime victims. I was wondering if people had thoughts about that.
As information, I think all three of those are items that we are that we will be addressing in the language of the bill that I'm carrying this year.
I'm not surprised that you're a step ahead of us. So that's good. For what it's worth, I mean, I think cooperation with law enforcement is obviously tricky, and if the statute is ambiguous, I think quite problematic. I think if it is possible to find legitimate ways of identifying crime victims that are not police reports, I think that seems reasonable as well. And the prohibition on people on parole or probation for getting any benefit just seems like a no-brainer to me. But let's look into it, and we'd love to see bill languages that develops, and anything that we can do and staff can do to help Senator Skinner, that would be great.
Great, thanks.
All right. I think this is our last slide coming up. All right, this is our conversation of restorative justice. There were 2 or 3 ideas that were discussed at some length yesterday. The first, which is from the DA of Yolo County, Jeff Reisig, who I think not insignificantly is the current head of the District Attorneys Association. He was very enthusiastic about restorative justice as a right. And I was trying to clarify with him, and I'm surprised even that he would have such a strong position on this, but I think it's in the right direction. It's in the correct direction. Trying to not use the word right, which is that you set certain parameters of cases that are eligible for restorative justice. And he seemed quite open to them not being limited to just juveniles or just misdemeanors, but to a large percentage of crimes. And that if your crime falls into that criteria, and that there is an approved restorative justice program in that jurisdiction, that the victim has, first of all, a right to be notified that there's an opportunity for restorative justice. And then if the victim then chooses restorative justice, then that is the path that the case follows, regardless of whether or not the prosecution thinks that that's a wise route. And of course, we heard about the incident with the parole and the other case. I don't want to get too confused. In any event, I haven't looked closely enough at the specific proposal from DA Reisig. Is that a bill yet? Does anybody know that, Tom, Rick? Senator?
No, I don't think they were able to place it anywhere yet this year, so probably won't be. But it's written in that form.
I think it seems like we struggled as some of you might remember from our very first committee meeting. We talked about restorative justice, but we really struggled to find a statute there was no model statute, at least at the time, that we could really get our arms around it. It sounded like a good idea. The data seemed promising, but it seems like in the past year or two, since we've had that presentation, that there's been a lot of developments on that front, or at least we've gathered a lot more information. And I'm very eager to try to see if this statute proposal from DA Reisick makes sense for us. And I particularly think the framing it as a victim's right seems to put it in the correct framework of restorative justice. So I'm quite bullish on this idea, at least in the abstract. All right. Any other thoughts to add to that? All right. The final idea that we didn't really discuss yesterday, but was in the materials from Tom and Rick, is expanding the idea of civil compromise. Civil compromise exists in California statute right now, meaning that if somebody commits a crime against you, and I guess it's basically a financial settlement that the victim agrees to, then the case essentially disappears. Is that right, Rick, Tom?
That's a good way of putting it.
All right.
The victim can drop the charges, basically the only time they have that right.
Right.
I don't know if they have a right to notification, as we're talking about with the restorative justice.
Well, they're part of the agreement. They have to agree.
No, but are you notified up front, Justice Moreno? For example, when you come into a misdemeanor case as a victim, are you notified that this is even an opportunity for you?
Well, I think, I don't think there's an obligation. I mean, usually the defense lawyer makes that proposal to the DA and says, can't we civilly compromise this case? So it's defense counsel who brings it up, not the prosecution. And it's quite a valuable tool. I mean, a lot of cases get resolved: vandalism, thefts, any number of other kinds of cases where the victim, agrees to basically restitution on the spot, and the case is civilly compromised, and the matter's dismissed. It happens all the time.
Well,
And I think I think it should apply to certain felonies. I mean, it's, maybe not a violent felony, but certainly any other kind of felony where you can measure, the amount of loss could be civilly compromised.
I agree with it. So currently right now, it's, as the slide suggests, it's limited in California to misdemeanors. And my only concern with expanding it is, does it give a get out of jail card to rich people, right?
It does. It does. You could have like a felony vandalism, right? And if you've got a defendant who can come up with the money and the victim wants to get, resolve the damages issue, yeah. And I'm sure it's done all the time. So maybe in that sense it is inequitable, but it's a way really to dispose of cases, for sure.
As I said earlier, if somebody broke into my car, my primary goal would be to get the window
There you go.
replaced.
You would civilly compromise that.
I certainly would. I was wondering if other people had thoughts. Tom, I know that you've been thinking about this for quite a while. I'm curious if other states have it, or this idea of, rich people being able to buy their way out of jail.
Other states have we all use identical language, so it's not much help. And I think one thing to focus on is it just says if the victim receives satisfaction, then the case can be compromised. So the statute doesn't limit it to just money. So perhaps if that term was given a bigger scope to say, this could be cash, it could be some other thing. So it sort of becomes restorative justice without maybe as much process involved. That might be interesting. So you sort of have the sort of restorative justice we heard about yesterday, where there's, a a lot more involvement with the mediator, or for cases where the victim may say, you know what, I'm not interested in that, but if you do X, Y, and Z, I'm happy to resolve it this way. Civil compromise could play a role there. So it wouldn't have to be limited to money only. You could borrow some of those principles from restorative justice for it.
Yeah, and part of the agreement would be that the defendant is going to do some community service. And, for an NGO or something, and it's something that the victim is interested in, some charitable thing, and that could be sort of woven in, and that's not monetary. But generally, it involves damages and compensation for it.
And Justice Moreno, this gets back to your original point of concern about the diversion suggestion from the Retail Association. I see that as almost civil compromise.
Yeah,
right?
could be, yeah.
I know that the different words and their buzzwords and their terms of art and whatnot, but if if Walgreens says, we're happy to drop the charges as long as you participate in X number of hours of training, job training, sobriety, whatever it happens to be, that's the same, seems like the same thing as to me.
Yeah. So it's worth anyway expanding and seeing all the different avenues for which, the term civil compromise. I mean, what is it? 1377, 78?
That's right. Very good.
I'm only going back about 45 years, guys.
Well, the statute's been there since 1872. So
Yeah, okay. Well, that's before my time. But I remember as a prosecutor and as doing some pro bono defense work later in my career, using this as a valuable tool. And there's no sense putting some of these things on a person's record that could be disabling in the future. Everybody walks away kind of happy, and the main thing is that the person, the victim, be compensated in some way, and then not be extended out. Where you run into a problem is where you say you're working on a 1377, 78 over a 12-month period, and that just brings a lot of headache for everybody.
Well, I think it's worth exploring. I think that, so there's two areas to explore there. Is both the expanding the crimes that are eligible beyond misdemeanors, and then the ways that people can feel satisfied, however that might be, whether it's financial or otherwise.
Carlos, I have a.
I'm just wondering, does the judge or the DA have to agree to that? I remember one judge was really upset that the DA was civilly compromising a case I was handling as a defense lawyer. But
that was my question, Carlos, is does the prosecution have the ability to veto a civil compromise, or does the judge have the authority over their objection to accept a civil compromise between the parties and dismiss it?
Yeah.
Well, I think that that's an interesting question, and goes towards the idea of what Jeff Reisick was talking about. Is this being a right, meaning that the victim has control here?
Yeah.
That if the victim wants it, then neither the judge nor the prosecutor has authority to overcome. Anyway, that's something I think that we should explore in the different ways. If it needs approval, if so, by whom? But I think that in the restorative justice context that Jeff Reisick was talking about, that the judge nor the prosecution could veto the victim's request for restorative justice. And my first blush would be the same would go here, but I think we should think some more about that.
Yeah.
The way the law is now is the judge still has the discretion, has to decide whether to dismiss it or not. But I believe could be over the prosecutor's objection, though I assume that would weigh quite heavily. So it's up to the judge ultimately right now.
Okay.
All right. Well, we've come to the end of our slideshow. Before we wrap things up, we didn't go over every single topic that was discussed yesterday. And before we send Rick and Tom and then soon to be Joy off to do further research and report back to us, were there other ideas or concepts or thoughts that any of you had that we want to further explore.
I was intrigued by the discussion around, I forget who was speaking about it, but there was one of our, at least one panelist who spoke about that the victims of crime who don't report the crime. And so going back to the thing about the compensation and changing whether it's just a police report, that you can change what needs the verification, but doesn't necessarily mean that it wouldn't have been a reported crime. You see what I'm saying? So there's this whole category of, is there, let's take sexual assault, for example. We know that it is, well, we know crime in general, there's a huge percent that's not reported, but we know that sexual assault especially is very low reporting. Do we want our victim services or programs, or is there a justification to do more for victims who are not those who then are part of this whole system? Because most everything else is triggered by virtue of you. It's a crime that then is going to be prosecuted.
Yeah, well, I don't see how I think there has to be some reporting requirement. We're talking about the penal code and law enforcement doing an investigation. If you don't report an incident, then you're basically not seeking a remedy contained in the penal code.
Right,
I
right.
don't know why we would become kind of a general insurer for people who suffer harm, however that's created, without some foundation in the criminal justice system. It's the penal code after all.
Mhm.
I'm not sure I agree with you, Justice Moreno. I mean, I think that the point of the penal code is, sorry to get too abstract here about, justice
Yeah.
and public safety. And that includes making victims as whole as possible as a society. And
Right.
merely punishing people. I mean, I think that there's one thing that we've learned, that merely punishing people does not make victims whole and does not satisfy public safety. So to the extent that these crimes are being committed, and what do we do as a state to benefit those people, whether or not the defendants, I mean, should it require the defendants are actually caught, arrested, prosecuted, convicted? I mean, if you're robbed, you're robbed. That you happen to be lucky enough that the person who robbed you was caught, and then you get restitution because they were caught, and the other person doesn't quite seem to resonate with me. Obviously we want to avoid fraudulent reporting of crime victims, but I do think that as a society we owe something, or maybe not owe is maybe too strong a word, but that we should try our best to make crime victims as whole as possible.
Yeah. I'm just referring, I thought our work was tethered to the penal code.
All of this is in the penal code already, but you're correct. You're correct. I may be exceeding my jurisdiction here, Your Honor.
I'll sustain the objection. Otherwise, we're gonna, take on everything. I mean, we're looking at the penal code.
Believe me, I'm ready. No, I kid. But so Senator Skinner, though, to get more back to your point, so we talked about the victim's compensation as not being necessarily tied to a police report. I wasn't quite clear on what you were saying. So,
well, I don't want to go far afield of the penal code, but part of our look at it, obviously, is not obviously. This is our charge. We're looking at it from the lens of improving public safety. That's one of our charges. And it occurred to me that, is there a change, and I don't know, that might lend is there a change to victim support that might lend itself to more reporting of crimes that is there something about the lack of victim support that is contributing to the non-report
Yeah.
of certain crimes?
I think that there's something to that. Certainly, I mean, anecdotally, you hear that people feel it's fruitless to report crimes, and
We can actually address that pretty specifically. You know, Rick mentioned the trauma recovery centers earlier, and there's some research done that folks who received service through there were much more likely to cooperate with law enforcement. And Senator Skinner, to your particular point about sexual assault, that is the least reported crime. It's only about 20% of those are reported. But folks who received assistance from one of these trauma recovery centers were 70% more likely to file a police report. Now, whether that is the right outcome, but it, you know, it indicates that some of these issues we're talking about, that there is a cause and effect with victim services. And so it's, I don't know, a little bit relevant to the discussion.
Right.
and to wrap it up to the beginning too. I mean, prior to today's conversation, I was not unaware of these victim recovery centers, and I think that, you know, the lack of information is a huge problem. Probably not that expensive or difficult to solve. And I think it's something, you know, as we said at the top, something that we should try to address on top of the other issues. All right. With that, are there other issues that we haven't talked about that came up yesterday, or was any of the materials that intrigued people? Okay, this is hardly the last that we'll be discussing these issues. The idea, just to remind everybody, is that staff will go back and, based on this conversation today and the priorities that we've identified, report back to us with further research and narrowing down our proposals. And that can go on throughout the year. Our basic deadline is, you know, the late fall. So we have a number of months to continue to think about and look into these issues. This is certainly not the last that we'll be talking about them, and further prioritize our ideas. As I think I told some of you, I was a little concerned that this topic wouldn't lead to many concrete recommendations, and I'm concerned that we have too many. So I suppose that's a good problem to have. Again, thanks to staff, especially to Rick, for pulling it all together. I look forward, again, Joy, I don't know if she's in the audience today. She'll be joining us. I'll introduce her at our next committee hearing, and we will be hiring another staff attorney for those more junior position for those of you either on the committee or in the public who might be interested or know somebody who might be interested in applying. Thank you all. Have a good weekend, and unless anybody else has anything to say, all right, this meeting's adjourned. See you all soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.